Thank you for joining us and welcome. My name is Shaun Matsheza. I'm with the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and we're hosting this event together with Equal Rights and Revolutionary Reparations. It feels like a time of crisis that we're in. Seems like we've stumbled from one crisis to the other globally. Many problems we face are because of centuries of exploitation and extraction, ongoing exploitation and extraction. We bear witness to obscene levels of wealth inequality. It's a disgrace that we have in 2023 so many people living in dire poverty. And all of this happening at a time when the climate is changing and we're literally putting the planet on fire. So there's a need for change. Systemic, economic, social, and political change. We need to shift resources to upscale investment in public resources. We need to address climate change and mitigation. We need to pay for a just transition, and we need to address centuries of structural inequality and exploitation. Many organizations and movements have been dealing with this issue over time, and in particular, today, we're looking at a tax system that can assist us to achieve this. We've got the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, for instance, that's been working on this, the Tax Justice Network. So there's an ongoing process to find a tax system that works for everyone. So today's conversation is essentially an addition to this ongoing work. It is while there's a moral and logical case already been made for a more equitable and more just tax system, the question that always comes up and that follows is then how are we going to have this global tax system that is equitable and fair? How can we shift resources from those who have accumulated them? And how can we have more equity and justice in wealth distribution at a global level outside of the national boundaries that most countries operate in? Today's speakers are forwarding two very radical proposals for how we can achieve this global equity in terms of tax redistribution. The first speaker so we've got Laura Bannister with Equal Rights and Keval Bharadia with Revolutionary Reparations. Sara Murawski will be a participant also from the Transnational Institute. But the first presenter will be Keval, who is the founder and director of Revolutionary Reparations, which is an organization that's working for reparations from enslavement and colonialism and a pathway to systemic change. He previously worked as a financial market designer in the City of London, which has significantly informed his critique of the global financial system. And Keval today is going to present to us a radical program for tax justice based on what he calls the financial transactions tax. So I won't take more time. I will hand it over to you, Keval. Over to you.
Thank you, Shaun, and everyone for coming today. So Revolutionary Reparations is a new and unfunded radical campaign that occupies a unique position within the world of progressive organizations working to eradicate poverty, multiple inequalities, debt servitude, racism, patriarchy, climate change, and other struggles and injustices. We speak a decolonial and uncomfortable truth, not spoken by the NGO and international development industries. We want system change and define exactly what this means. Our policy embodies a deep tradition of emancipation and liberation theories for reparations, for enslavement and colonialism. This means we see historic injustices undergoing constant reformulation by the incumbent rich and powerful, who administer and organize a war-torn, exploitative, extractive, and overtly unequal and evil system, capitalism. We analyze the bloodshed of imperialism with a contemporary analysis of global political economy and hyper-financialized capitalism, the source of power today. We are still in the political and economic formations set in stone a few hundred years ago that saw a small minority kidnap or obliterate entire societies from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, as the Israeli state and military is doing today to Palestinian civilians, nothing short of a Holocaust in 2023. Reparative justice is firstly rooted in apologies and truth. It is a process for healing and repair for centuries of capitalist and imperialist exploitation. Reparative justice is not only for the world's enslaved, their descendants, racialized and colonized and oppressed people. It is for all working class people and for humanity. We must all be free of the system based on infinite growth and exponentially rising inequality, free from the logic and laws of profit, borders, and private property. This is why reparations has always meant nothing less than taking a revolutionary approach to building a new world order. Our analysis over the last 500 years shows that the commodity and financial markets sits at the center of the globalized capitalist economy. It is the most essential and systemically targetable component in the machinery of capitalism, enabling multinational corporations to carry out their essential functions, enabling the world's richest and powerful to speculate on our exploitation and build unimaginable wealth and power in the process, which is clear to see through billionaires, lobbying, ideological capture, and hegemony. This renders reform and regulation ineffective and a distraction, which those with power are happy to let the NGO industry busily pursue. The design of this financial transaction tax makes it the ultimate non-reformist reform. It is a revolutionary use of reform in its truest sense and makes non-violent system change in our lifetime possible. Previous campaigns for a financial transaction tax were not able to sustain their momentum. So things have to be done differently now. We must seek to constantly build on our successes together, whether that is the pink tide in Latin America, the Arab Spring, the anti-racist and gender justice movements post George Floyd and Me Too, or the Indian farmers movement. Link our campaigns against the fossil fuel finance campaigns with big pharma and agribusiness. We must start acknowledging the certainties and symptoms of capitalism and imperialism. The financial transaction tax has been designed through the lens of reparations struggles for enslavement and colonialism, anti-racism, Pan-Africanism, the Black radical tradition, intersectional feminism, Black Marxism, workers' liberation struggles, Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nation struggles, and anti-colonialism struggles. The objective is clear. It is to create a systemic and radical global policy and movement for justice, peace, equality, and sustainability by recognizing the inseparability of people's struggles that are all tied to capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. The tax on commodity and financial market transactions is unprecedented, and that it covers every major asset class traded in all spaces. Shares and debts of corporations such as fossil fuel polluters, arms dealers, and financial institutions, world currencies, interest rate derivatives, bonds, credit default swaps, and other fixed income assets, wholesale gas and oil, gold and silver, metals, lithium, and other resources and minerals, and global food crops such as wheat, coffee, cocoa, and sugar. The daily value traded in these markets is on average $16 trillion. These markets are on traditional exchanges, online trading platforms, and set up between global investment banks and other intermediaries. These markets, organizations, and processes originate from the financing and development of European empire building, industrialization, and modernity, all of which were predicated on enslavement and colonialism. These are patterns of exploitation, extraction, plunder, and authoritarianism that have been in place for 500 years. Today, these markets are crucial for international business and finance, wealth hoarding, and ultimately power building. It is the meeting place for the world's high net worth individuals, investment banks, hedge funds, private equity firms, asset managers, auditors, accountants, lawyers, ratings agencies, shadow banks, tax havens, insurance firms, pension firms, and brokers. There is a reason why we have the saying, they who own the banks run the tanks. The daily value of $16 trillion across the markets can be understood as the net present value of both slavery and colonialism and future exploitation and subjugation of people and planet. It is the value of future profits and fictitious capital in the financial markets that reinforces the drive for the powerful to dominate the global majority politically, economically, and culturally. As the central flow of capital from which wealth and power derives, it is our most important struggle, our most important site of struggle for reparative justice and for understanding the value of the system today on which enslavement and colonialism was based. Approximately 1/3 of the global value traded in the commodity and financial markets flows through London, and another third through New York and Chicago, underscoring not only the legacy of empire, but where the engines of imperialism ultimately reside, and who therefore is in the driving seat of global racism, plunder, and terror. It is finance that drives military budgets and the global presence of authoritarian and fascist regimes to engineer regime change in order to protect and grow it. The World Bank, IMF, WTO, and other capitalist entities are mere manifestations of the foreign policies of these imperialist regimes, created to ensure perpetual growth and no interruption to global extraction and plunder. But just a 1% tax on $16 trillion would raise $160 billion each day. This is enough to end poverty, hunger, and destitution overnight. It is enough to build a loss and damage fund, finance a just transition, and wipe out global South debts in a week. We would finally, after 5 centuries, be able to tell the truth, heal, and repair our decimated communities. But reparations has never meant merely apologies or economic compensation. It has always meant a reckoning with and changing of today's global political and economic hegemony, built on and reliant upon the creation of racial superiority and hierarchies, where white supremacy reigns supreme. True reparations are nothing less than revolutionary and are for all of us. There is no wealth under capitalism that is free of the bloodshed of enslavement and colonialism. All wealth and power in existence today has been grown from historical wealth through a process of interest, leverage, and compounding. All wealth is predicated on the needs to manufacture racism, hatred, patriarchy, fascism, and inequalities for its survival. Capitalism can never be ethical. And as capitalism is centered on class and racial exploitation and hierarchies, all capitalism is thus racial capitalism. So raising the tax rate beyond 1% interferes with the way the rich and powerful manage to generate exponential wealth and power, as it raises the cost of capital, the cost of doing business at the core of their day-to-day operations. Raising the rate incrementally over time effectively draws down the limitless power of elites, enabling us to peacefully transition to a new world order. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But before I get into the practicalities, let me quickly just mention this. As you know, in 1974, the UN General Assembly adopted a new international economic order, spearheaded by the G77 and the non-aligned movement. The declaration set out what a new, just, and global economy should look like. Next year is the 50th anniversary, and this financial transaction tax must play a significant role in shaping that new global economy. The current chair of the G77 is Cuba, and it was Fidel Castro who advocated for a financial transaction tax in 2001 at the UN Durban Conference on Anti-Racism, where he said, an FTT would save the world before it's too late. Colombia's and Kenya's presidents, Gustavo Petro and William Ruto, both called for a financial transaction tax in this summer at the Paris Club meetings. At the very least, we must assist Cuba, Colombia, and Kenya to develop an expertly informed and powerful narrative for a global FDT for the 50th year anniversary of the new international economic order. As you already know, G7 countries dominate financial markets trading activity, and it is where legislation would need to be passed. We know this is an impossibility today, with most leaders having authoritarian agendas. Our task is not with the G7. It is to bring the peoples of the world together. We have to do better at linking our struggles and movements. Movements for reparations, indigenous and oppressed peoples, human rights, racial, feminist, climate, economic, and social justice movements, trade unions, and many others know we must unite to fight capitalism and imperialism, but have a multitude of theories of change that talk over each other. That has to end. We also need to unite behind a common policy that brings about system change for all. To wrap up, I think everyone on this call will agree with this. There is no racial justice under capitalism. There can never be gender justice under capitalism either. Similarly, exponentially rising inequality and climate change are intrinsic to the operation of capitalism. And finally, there can never be justice on stolen lands. So there is a real problem when NGOs and movements serve up thematically individualistic, isolated, and liberal reforms. These ultimately do us more harm than good. How are we a threat to capitalism and imperialism? How are we going to shut down the Western military-industrial complex? We must act differently. We must every day, at every moment, act with ruthless clarity that our struggles and injustices are inseparable and interwoven. We cannot solve for one without solving for all. We have to build a mass movement of movements, raising global awareness of the economic totality of capitalist and imperialist exploitation, which we know is $16 trillion a day and rising. It is the ultimate quantitative real-time indicator of all that we are losing and represents what the rich and powerful are killing people and planet for. We have to let this be known in all our movements so that our movements focus on the financial system, which is the engine of imperialism and from which power is derived. Power that we must target to dismantle if we are serious about doing tax justice or any other sort of justice. By doing this, I think we can do our bit to usher in political victories for the left over the next decade. We hope to build this movement collaboratively with you, and it needs your undivided help to do it. So thank you very much for listening and being here today. It's back to you, Shaun.
Thank you so much, Keval. And thank you for such a broad, wide-ranging vision that actually provides a mechanism for striking, as you say, the engine of the system that has led to so many people the world over living such lives of destitute in what is really a planet of abundance. I'm not going to dilute what you've just said. I will simply segue to Laura, who's going to give us the other side of this radical proposal, which is a wealth tax aligned next to the financial transaction tax. Laura, over to you.
Thanks very much, Shaun, and thanks, Keval, for that very deep context. I'm going to share my screen, so let me just get onto the right slide. Okay. So I wanted to talk about wealth tax, and specifically about wealth tax without borders. So wealth tax, which is taxing the accumulated fortunes of millionaires. It's usually proposed as a within country proposition. And it's really a hot topic at the moment. So activists are demanding it. Some political parties are showing interest. There's a lot of research going on. And the first thing I want to say in this presentation is that this is a really great first step. National wealth tax campaigns, that's always going to be the first step towards pulling a share of accumulated wealth down for the people. We need to address this at the national level first, because that is where the political system is currently oriented. And we really support those campaigns, and we stand behind the activists here who are working on those. However, as this debate emerges and as wealth tax becomes popularized, there's two really key questions that I hope people will begin to keep in mind. So the first question is, where is most of the world's wealth held? And the second one is, where does that wealth really come from? And these questions are important because they inform our views about where wealth tax revenues should land. Because ultimately, this is about money. It's about moving money from the rich to the rest of us. And so we need to think about who are the rich, but also who are the rest of us that are relevant in a wealth tax scenario, because this has real implications for global justice and for people everywhere. So where is most of the world's wealth? Well, here's a map. And this is going to be zero surprise to everybody in this call. You all know this, yeah? So the dark areas are where there's people on average have over $100,000. The lightest areas are where people have below $5,000 in accumulated wealth. And no one is surprised. We know that wealth is predominantly in the global north. But why is wealth mostly in the global north? Well, there's lots of reasons, but the real core of it is about unequal exchange. So unfair trade, basically. So people in the south have to pay a lot for what they buy from the north, but people in the north expect to pay very little for what they buy from the south. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. It's come out of colonialism. It carries on for the same power reasons that still exist in a neo-colonial world system. And this is ultimately why wealth is in the north. We have got so used to that system of exchange that we think it's normal. We even think it maybe is natural that goods from certain places are like cheaper than goods from rich countries. But it's only recently that we've been able to quantify this. And there's some fantastic research come from Jason Hickel and his team, where they used carbon footprinting data to actually work out how much human labor and real resources are moving from south to north and north to south in exchange for money. And what they found was that ultimately the global north is sucking over $2 trillion worth of real wealth from the global south to the global north every year. So these numbers are like giant numbers. It's impossible to kind of visualize that. But to give a sense of scale, it's for every dollar of aid they received, 14 are lost through unequal exchange. So there is a constant sucking out of wealth. There's also further losses from tax evasion, from profit extraction, and from other sources. So there's wealth constantly being pulled away from the global south. And the question is, how do we get some of that back? Because what you end up with, if you don't return any of that, is a situation like this map. That's exactly how that map is created. And that map is never going to change until we invent mechanisms that pull that wealth back from the dark areas to the light areas from which it originally came. So how can we get that money back to the global south? Well, we believe that wealth tax provides a possible answer. And this is a radical take on wealth tax, and it's one that we would encourage the movement to give more thought to. So the key question here is, if wealth is mostly in the global north, then wealth tax revenues are mostly going to land in the global north as well. And that's a problem for the movement. So if we tax wealth only nationally, we end up with a huge inequality in the revenues that are generated. So we looked at some modelling that has been done by a team recently in the UK. So they modelled a relatively low level wealth tax on large fortunes, and they came out with a revenue of around $181 per person. We did some of our own modelling to look at what would happen if you applied that same wealth tax to wealth held across Africa as a whole, as a continent. But because Africa's wealth has predominantly been sucked out of Africa and taken to places like the UK, there's very small tax base. And so therefore, there's a very small revenue. So you end up with a revenue of around $3 per person. So that's 60 times less than the revenues that you're getting in the UK from the same tax. And in fact, it will be much less in most African countries because, of course, there's inequality across the African continent as well. And many countries have very, very little of that total wealth share. So that demonstrates that national wealth taxes would obviously completely inadvertently, but they would replicate the inequality that we already see in the world. They reflect it and they replicate it, they perpetuate it. And that is, it's an unfortunate and it is ultimately an avoidable consequence of wealth tax. Because here's the alternative. We can have international wealth tax. So international wealth tax, the first element is still a tax on net wealth. It's exactly the same idea. It's a tax on net wealth, and it will be paid only by millionaires and billionaires, by the world's super rich. There's two ways that it can be collected. The first is probably the simplest. It's that the tax would still be collected by national tax authorities as it is at the moment. And then those national authorities would pass the revenues onto an international authority. The second option is that an international authority, so like the UN tax body, for instance, could tax individuals directly. People could be directly responsible for paying tax to an international body. That's probably more complex to set up, but ultimately probably better for global justice in the long run. Either way, however you do it, the really important point is the third one, which is that wealth tax revenues are then shared beyond borders. And that creates a counterflow of wealth moving back to the global south. And here's a really crude, rubbish diagram of what that could look like. But the key is that the revenues are moving back. There is money moving back as well as moving out of the global south. And this is instead of hoarding those wealth tax revenues in the north. We don't think of it as hoarding. We think of tax revenues that are raised in a country as that country's revenues. But I think it's time to consider reframing that issue. If we understand and if we agree that wealth ultimately is generated by the people of the world acting together, and often particularly generated by the people in the global south, if that wealth is sucked out of those nations and then taxed, the revenues of that tax, there's a moral claim on it from the people from whom that wealth originated. And that's what we're trying to do with international wealth tax, bring that money back. Obviously, this doesn't in any way detract from the need to address unequal exchange, unfair trade. So we urgently need to do that. And I work, my other job, I have a second job, is working on trade justice. And I've worked on that for a number of years. And recently wrote a history of the entire trade justice movement and the setup of the trade system before it. And what that showed is that it's actually very, very difficult to address unfair trade while the world is as unequal as it is. So there's Keval mentioned the history of the declaration of the new international economic order. This was a huge attempt by the global south in the 70s to switch the dynamics of trade, to equalize how much is paid by the global north and the global south for goods on a basis of real value. And it was effectively stamped out by the global north because the global north had greater economic power. They were able to use their power over, being a creditor rather than a debtor nation, to effectively stamp out this radical and originally very successful proposal. So it's very, very difficult to address unequal exchange if you're not addressing inequality at the same time. So to borrow a phrase from Tony Blair, which is the only thing I'm ever going to borrow from Tony Blair, but we need to be tough on global inequality as well as tough on the causes of global inequality. We need to do both these things. We need to find a way to bring the wealth back as well as stopping the wealth leaking away. So how much could be raised? This is always the question. I'm a political economist, but I like doing the numbers. So we have looked into this, and the answer is loads, of course, and it depends how you do it. So I just want to remind you of the numbers in this slide. So this was a modelling of a relatively small tax, and it was raising $181 per person per year. Obviously, the same was much, much, much lower in Africa. This is our modelling. There's much more information about this and where these numbers come from in the briefing, which I will share with you at the end. But really, it's the last column that's interesting, which is that it's generating large revenues on a per person basis per year. So it is possible to generate really substantial amounts of money. Obviously, you could be even more radical and generate even bigger amounts of money. Also important in this scenario is that we're moving private wealth into a public wealth fund, and then using that to generate an ongoing payment for the people of the world, whether to their governments or to them as individuals. So this is a model that can continue in the long term as well, even if you strip away most of the wealth of the rich. Okay, how do we get there? So this is obviously a hugely radical demand. Anything worth doing is radical and difficult. And this is why this hasn't been addressed before. This is why it's something that's coming after national wealth tax as part of the movement. But it's important, and there's good reasons to be optimistic. So the first reason is that almost everybody wins with a wealth tax. So 98.8% of the world's people, including in rich countries, would not be affected by a wealth tax, would not be charged by a wealth tax. This targets millionaires. So if you're not one of those, this is not going to hurt you. So that means that there's very likely to be a high level of public support. And we've already seen high levels of public support for wealth tax in pretty much every country that's been surveyed. The second reason to be cheerful is that most people already support an international wealth tax if they're asked about it. So there was some recent polling by a French organization where they asked people in high income countries whether they would support a tax that taxed millionaires in their country and took the money to lower income countries. And 2/3 of people in every country surveyed agreed with that idea. The third reason to be cheerful is that the tax justice movement as a whole is already laying the groundwork for international tax. So international tax is completely reliant on the success of what the tax justice movement is already working on. They are doing incredible work, and we support that, we respect that, we stand with them. They're putting in place the infrastructure that mean we will be able to see what wealth people have around the world. We will be able to understand what assets people have, where money is being hidden, where it's moving, and we would therefore be able to tax it. That work is vital for international tax to succeed, but they are winning gradually but impressively on that. So there's good reasons to be cheerful. Here's how we can make the change happen. I won't go through it in detail, but basically we want you to co-create this concept with us. This is a really new idea. I mean, the idea of global redistribution is obviously as old as the hills, but doing this through tax is new. But we think there's real potential here, and we want you to work with us to develop that. And then we need to work together to build the movement ultimately. The fifth point on here is about locating potential first adopter countries. So if we don't go in for this with a big bang, which is very difficult to achieve, we can find countries that are willing to work together to run wealth taxes where they pool the revenues of those taxes between them and share those revenues. And then we can build that scheme out from there. And here's what you guys can do to help make it happen in your organizations or as individuals. You can join our working group. So we want to build this campaign with you. And the first meeting of that working group will be in January. We've already got 20 organizations signed up, and we're really, really excited to talk with them. So we hope more of you will join that. Make international wealth tax a part of your active campaign agenda, even if that's 1% of it. So we understand there is already a lot to do on tax justice. There's all of the financial transparency and key tax justice work that we just mentioned. And there's getting national wealth tax or wealth tax as a general idea. We completely respect that work needs to be done, and that is vital for this work to succeed. But don't leave this work until all of that is successfully completed. It's going to be a long fight to make international tax happen, but it is vital for global justice. Otherwise, we don't want to create a system ultimately that replicates global inequality and perpetuates it. And so we need to start dedicating some of our campaign agenda and some of our campaign time and attention to this kind of cause. We hope that you'll invite your allies to participate and publicize this work. We're a small organization and a small network. Many of you here are much bigger and with huge networks. We hope that you will help to popularize this. And then, we want to hear from you. What you do best. So let us know how you think you can participate in this movement. We're really keen to hear from you. So yeah, thanks for joining us. There's a link to the briefing there, and there's a link to join the working group. And if you want to talk to us, we would be delighted to talk to you. There's my email and there's Keval's email. So yeah, thanks very much. And I'll pass it back to Shaun.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that very, very detailed presentation on how we can actually start moving wealth from the global north to the global south, and maybe mitigate some of what has been happening across history, where wealth has been moved from the global south to the north and continues to be extracted. It sounds like an extremely complicated scheme. It sounds like something that is so far away and maybe impossible to achieve. But as I always say, it seems impossible until somebody does it. And it has to begin somewhere. The conversation has to begin somewhere, and we need to create guiding lights and strategies that we can all then rally behind to achieve some sort of global justice in our lifetimes. I would like to invite people here in the meeting to raise questions to our speakers. But before we go to those questions and allow responses from our presenters, I'd like to give the floor to our last presenter, who is my colleague, Sara Murawski, with whom I work at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. And she is going to reflect on these last two presentations. Over to you, Sara.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shaun. And hi, everyone. Really nice to see so many new and known faces in the room. I'll try to keep it brief because I realize we don't have that much time on the clock to pose all your certainly relevant questions. So first of all, I really appreciate your proposals and your presentations, Laura and Keval, and the critical conversation you're opening up, especially in times, of course, of climate crisis, but also unprecedented debt levels and many manifold limitations that countries in the global south face regarding finance for development and climate action. And I also think that the key concept you're both using, unequal exchange, should really be at the core of what's wrong with this world, and build from there how we try to transform into a truly just green economy for all. And I think taxation should indeed be a core part thereof. So I work for the Transnational Institute, TNI, which is a research institute based in Amsterdam, and we work with and for social movements for almost 50 years. So next year will be our 50th anniversary together with the UN Declaration, so that's nice. I myself also have a background in working on international trade, so it's nice to hear from you, Laura, that you still work on this, because there's still a lot to be gained there. I now mainly focus on macroeconomics and finance for our Knowledge Hub, which provides like big picture analysis and convenes scholar activists around the globe. And finance for TNI is a critical issue for all of us, of course. On the one hand, of course, where the public money is currently spent on, and unfortunately, big amounts are still spent to subsidize the wealthy and big corporations, whereas it should be the other way around. They should be taxed and deliver for the global south so that they can transition to a just economy as well. And on the other hand, of course, it's also important to reflect on how we can redirect private and public money and capital flows to where it should be spent. So really focusing on how to finance a just future. To just mention some examples, we work with migrant justice movements, looking at how public money is supporting a military industry which builds walls and militarizes borders rather than helping those that have been displaced. We work on the just transition with just transition peasant and fisher movements, and they have demonstrated how public money is allowing food, water, and energy transnationals to greenwash their impacts and continue exploitative extractive practices. So that's something we continue researching and fighting. And we work with radical municipalist movements, trying to make the case for shifting services from privatized corporations to publicly accountable ownership, to make sure that money indeed goes to the users and the community rather than wealthy shareholders. And I know we've recently also published a new report on this greenwashing issue. So coming a bit more to the content, of course, we need a major upscaling of public investments, which is, I think, why your arguments are so key. So we need money to address climate mitigation and adaptation, loss and damage, as you, Keval, indeed stressed, which will also be on the agenda of the COP, to pay for just transition, and to address centuries of structural inequality, which is indeed rooted in colonialism created by the global north. Just to mention one more number, because I agree, Laura, very much with you that numbers matter. By 2025, if no extra steps are taken, the amount of money needed by emerging economies to effectively tackle climate change will amount to 1 trillion, which is a lot of money, which we could indeed fund with a wealth tax, for example. If it's not going to happen, it will have to come from somewhere else, like a loss and damage fund. And of course, we know that low-income regions such as South Asia and Africa will have the largest investments needs. So that's really where the money needs to go. Just to mention, one of the main sources expected to deliver more climate finance, apart from blended finance, which is a whole story in itself, is domestic resource mobilization. So that really looks at how national taxation can help countries to deliver enough money for the green transition. But we also see that progress there is very slow. And studies on the projected development of tax to GDP ratios in emerging economies show that, yes, tax revenues will increase a bit, but not significantly. And that's also why I think that your proposals for a global wealth tax and a financial transaction tax are so important. I'm coming to an end. So, of course, we know obstacles will be huge. The power of the global finance industry, its lobby power, has so far stopped even modest attempts of a financial transaction tax. Also spotlighting the obscene wealth of billionaires has not yet succeeded to stop their huge extraction of wealth globally. And that also has to do, of course, with how the world is constructed on this unequal exchange practice. But of course, given the urgency of a swift and just transition, which is in all our interests, global north and global south, I think now is indeed the time to call for global tax justice yet again, and even more loudly, because we can also see that in part thanks to Black Lives Matter, the issue of reparations for colonial crimes is very high on the agenda. The same goes also for loss and damage, where the North really has to take responsibility for polluting the whole world, whereas in the South, people suffer most from these practices, and they have the least means to invest in the transition. And I indeed agree very much with you that the clear urgency of the climate crisis shows that we need radical tax justice to invest in the system change that we need. And I'm very happy that you've showcased your great proposals today, and I hope we can take this step further all together with this group. That's it for now, Shaun.
Thank you so much, Sara. So these are the presentations from Revolutionary Reparations, from Equal Rights, Sara from Transnational Institute. This conversation is ongoing, and we hope will continue in a much more condensed manner with the working group. We've shared the link in the chat for joining the working group. And now we have a quarter of an hour at the most to respond to some urgent questions that folks might have in the meeting. So if you have, first I will ask Priya, do we have questions in the chat? I see Ahmed Hafezi is asking, do these models and proposals assume existing forms of economic activity? Isn't revenue generation predicated on current patterns of consumption and extraction between the North and the South? Would one of you like to take that? Keval, would you like to take that one?
The short answer is yes, obviously it does, because it's a real-time evaluation of all business and finance activity that's being done through the financial system. Profits, wages, expenditure, all of these are represented, for example, in share prices of companies. It's a real-time indicator of exactly everything flowing through the financial system in totality. The other question is, what institutions do you envisage coordinating something like this? If Laura wants to come back to the other question, she can, but I'll just quickly mention here that I think that the institutions that we currently have need radical reorientation and power shifting away from the global North. So I think we are yet to build the institutions and architecture that is capable of pushing through revolutionary reparations. But I think we have to keep shining a light on the totality of capitalist and imperialist exploitation, which is $16 trillion a day and rising. These are the scales in which we're talking about. And the current institutions that we have are here to promote capitalist and imperialist ventures.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. That's okay. So is the revenue generation predictions based on current patterns of consumption and extraction? Well, they do look at the world economy as it is. The wealth tax model, and we've also modeled financial transaction tax in a similar way. We look at, we do build in, can't remember what you call them, but kind of erosion factors, if you like. So the wealth tax that we are proposing is much higher than the rates proposed by most wealth tax proposals, and so it's significant enough that it would actually diminish the fortunes of the wealthy. So you have to, obviously, people with money makes money, so you have to have a wealth tax rate that goes above the rate at which money makes money, and that's something that we do. What that does then is it erodes the fortunes of the wealthy, and it's likely to change their behavior ultimately. So we build that in to the calculations, and we build it in a slightly fudged way based on some stronger work by the Wealth Inequality. Oh my goodness, I've just forgotten the name of the organization. By Thomas Piketty's organization. They have a global wealth tax calculator, and we use the same kind of conversion factors that they use. So we're trying to look at what would happen realistically if you started to move the wealth away. The other important feature about the way we model wealth tax, which is unusual in wealth tax modeling, is that because we're not moving private wealth into public income, like that then gets spent and is kind of lost, if you like. We suggest moving private wealth into public wealth, so that if you think currently, the basis of private wealth is ownership of the world economy. So we're moving we're taking away the money and therefore the ownership and moving that into public ownership. So what we're ultimately ending up with is public ownership of the means of production. And so, you know, whether or not you continue to extract revenue from that, or whether you decide to keep that revenue within kind of those public organizations, if you like, and for instance, use it to pay workers higher rates or reduce prices for goods for consumers, both of those have benefits for the public. They wouldn't necessarily spit out the same numbers that we've got, but ultimately they would bring benefits of that kind of scale to the public in that way. So I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer in a concise way. I don't know if that covers it, and please feel free to email me if you want to understand more how we've done it. And the other point to say on that is, you know, our modeling is the best that we can manage with the tools that we've got available to us. You know, I would love to get my hands on some decent software that could do this in a more sophisticated way. And if you have access to that, or you would like to work with us on that, we would be delighted. At the moment, this is the best that we can manage with what we've got. And what we're trying to do here is give a sense of scale and a sense of, you know, of just how transformative this can be. The exact numbers, of course, are not going to be there, but we want to give a sense that this could be really huge for the world, because we believe that it could. In terms of what institutions do envisage coordinating something like this, I touched on this in the presentation. So the ideal for me would be to have international bodies collecting tax directly from rich people. You would obviously need governments being willing to enforce those obligations. So for instance, to you know, arrest tax evaders that were not paying their international taxes, as well as those that don't pay their national taxes. But I think it would be ideal for money to move directly to international organizations. The best way of managing those organizations would be as democratically as possible. And we float some options for that in terms of, for instance, oversight by a global people's assembly. There's also options about doing this through the United Nations or through regional bodies like the European Union or the African Union. We haven't got like a final perfect answer to that. Like, how do you do global democratic management? It's hard. You know, we haven't had lots of practice doing this as a world. We've tried to draw on the best examples out there that we can come across. But ultimately, this isn't for us to decide, obviously. And, you know, the answer we can give is we would want it to be as democratic as possible. There are some options. You know, we look forward to discussing them.
Thank you so much, Laura. I see Mohammed El Naim. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Please.
No, it's great,
ahead.
great. Yeah, hi all. My name is Mohammed. I only know a few of you. I recently started an organization called Decolonial Center. And the Decolonial Center will be an encyclopedia on colonialism. It will also have a podcast where we talk to writers, and in a newscast. Hopefully, the progress of this movement will incorporate that into our newscast, anti-colonial news. But more generally than that, I think that this is extremely inspiring, both the financial transaction tax and the inequality tax or the wealth tax. The question for me is a question of distribution. You know, during the times of decolonization, one of the things is that we were all kind of adamant, we want our independence, but we'll leave all those complicated questions till later. Now we're in this exciting moment with loss and damages, or in this exciting moment where we're having conversations like this. The question is, what happens if that money, if it gets through, it goes to the wrong hands? You know, I mean, Haiti is a good example. A lot of the protests are in Haiti against the Petrocaribe scandal were based on the fact that Venezuela gave a big chunk of money to the Haitians and the ruling elite put it in their pockets. And so the question of distribution and the institutions that have to be built are really important. I think one of the most important things is that while we take inspiration from the new international economic order and everything, we also think about those grassroots places where who could be the actual participants. In Sudan, for example, we had the revolution, and we have these resistance committees, these democratic resistance committees in the neighborhood councils who are not recognized by the international community. The elites are, but they're the ones who are at the pulse of the movement. They're the ones that can get closer. So I guess all I just want to ask, or just the challenge I want to provide, is just to think about how to make sure that the wealth tax and reparations doesn't go to states and elites who themselves are part of the problem. They're the ones putting their money in the city of London in the first place, but it goes to the people. So that was just a suggestion.
I'd love to respond if that's all right, Shaun.
Yes, please go ahead, Laura.
Great. So we yeah, that's a huge question, and that's how excuse me, that was actually the starting point for our organization. Because my co-founder works, he's a development economist working on public finance, and has huge doubts about money passing through governments of all kinds, including global north governments, and also passing through the hands of consultants like him, and how much is lost as things like move through those economies, and how little gets through to the people that ultimately deserve and really own this money. So we have always favored a direct cash, a universal basic income approach, a borderless universal basic income, or a global universal basic income. We don't think that's the only good way that money can be distributed, and I think it's important to also address the challenges of getting money to public bodies in an accountable way. Public bodies, both larger and smaller, community bodies like the ones that you mentioned. But one of the benefits of bringing money down to the grassroots is that if money is going to every individual, that's not to say that it doesn't mean that money stays with that individual forever. It's not to suggest that money should not bounce up to the public level, but it's about bringing the money first down to the people of the world. And from there, it can be distributed by them to the organizations and to the bodies that make sense in their society. It can also be taxed from them by their national governments or by their local governments to provide public services. But it's about bringing it to the grassroots first, and then letting it move on from that point. And that way you can have a guaranteed transfer with no interruption, nothing getting lost on the way. It's landing where you want. So I think there's a real benefit to that. However, public services, the Global Loss and Damage Fund, these are all also extremely important. So, there's going to be a tension, of course, with how you distribute the money, and there should be. And, but I can't wait for a kind of world where we've got a huge public fund of money that is ours, and we can argue about how to spend it and how to distribute it. Like, that is a world I want to be in. That is an argument I want to be having. So, I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Laura. I will give Keval 2 minutes to give final thoughts.
Yeah.
I know that's a big ask, but please take a shot.
I'll try and spend also a bit of time just responding to Mohammed, because he raises a very important question as well. And we must acknowledge that if we're even in the realms of having to worry about the distribution a part of this remaking of our world, we are already in a very, very different political climate, right? But we have to set up our campaigns with the intention of system change. And what that means is that our distribution, a loss and damage fund, a just transition, is half the problem. Yeah, how do we ultimately dismantle capitalism and imperialism? Right? Only that will stop racism, fascism, and imperialism, right? And we have to remember that at the beginning of the project, so that we explain that to all of our struggles and in all of our movements. When you do that, the task becomes very clear, in that this isn't a transfer of wealth, right? This is trying to remake our world, trying to heal and repair for 5 centuries of colonial plunder and exploitation, right? The redistribution is chapter A. We have chapter B, C, and D to write in a post-capitalist world, right? So we need to fundamentally remake our world, a grand, big narrative that's been missing for eons in the way NGOs do their work. We want to live in a world without NGOs. We have to be free of capitalism and imperialism. So that's my take on the question of redistribution. That we have to remember, we set up the problem at the beginning of our project, which is that unequal exchange is a symptom of the system, right? We don't end with equal exchange, right? We have to end with a planet without capitalism and imperialism, devolved communities and societies without borders, without fascism, without private land ownership. That is what we must do, right? And we must think about that at the beginning of the process. So the ideological framing that we have at the beginning is very important, and that influences the narrative, how we work together, how we communicate our struggles. There's plenty more to say. I think I've probably gone over time, but hopefully we've got a couple of minutes to wrap up as well. Thank you all very much for coming, and can't wait to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Keval. And thank you everyone for joining this super important conversation. I think we're at a moment in history where everyone, at least everywhere I look, everyone feels there is a need for a fundamental change. I think there are conversations happening across the board in the last 20 years due to social media, due to conversations happening, more global interaction. There is a conversation about where is the world going after this. And I think this is a particular moment that calls for imagination. I think it's a moment that calls for courage. And I think it's a moment that calls for daring. It's a moment that calls for people who are willing to go bail the cat. I think this is a particular moment where we need to think about the world being something that was made and thus can be unmade and recreated anew. And I think we need to have this conversation. It starts somewhere. We need to set beacons and guiding lights and come together from the grassroots, from the bottom up, as a global community to say the way the world is set up right now is not the way we want it to be set up. And the only way we're going to change it is to come up with alternative ideas and to put in the work behind those ideas. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining what we hope will be a long, ongoing path to this brave new world, this bold new vision that we have for a world without borders, without this exploitative system that has led to so many people unnecessarily living on the brink of starvation. Thank you so much. Follow the link to the working group, and we hope to see you again where we can deepen this conversation and we can take this further than just what we had today. Much appreciated.